Welcome back. When I first arrived in Florida in the early 90s, one of the most powerful men in the state was Jorge Mas Canosa, chairman of the Cuban American National Foundation. What made Mas Canosa so powerful was that he knew how to play Republicans and Democrats against each other to get exactly what he wanted when it came to U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba. He was able to do that because he understood that Florida was a swing state and the votes of Cuban Americans could decide who would be the President of the United States. But now that Florida is a red state, does that calculus change? With Democrats now believing the path to the White House no longer runs through Florida, will politicians continue to pander to the more extreme elements of the Cuban exile community? I posed those questions to Rick Herrero, Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group, Simon Rosenberg, President of NDN and the New Policy Institute, and Joe Garcia, a former Democratic member of Congress.
I think, first of all, my hope is that we don't give up on Florida and that we continue to try to reclaim some of the lost ground there. But I think that what your question, where you are probably right, is that it may free up parts of the Democratic Party that aren't as concerned about winning elections, right? Or don't care about Florida. They may make the argument internally inside the party that, hey, look, we're not going to be competitive there. And it may cause there to be people who don't traditionally like where we are in Cuban policy to be more aggressive. I think I still think that Bob Menendez is going to have a very significant role in setting the Democrat strategy towards Latin America and Cuba. But it's possible that Bob has more opposition than he did, and that there's more of a contentious fight than before. That's certainly possible, given what's happened. Part of what I think is going to drive significant administration engagement in this region is what's happening at the border. And just recently, for the first time in recent American history, we had more people show up at the border who were from Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua than from the rest of Latin America. That had never happened before, right? And what it means is the people now coming to the border and asking for asylum are fleeing failed communist regimes. I don't think we know yet what it means that a majority of people presenting themselves for asylum at the border are from communist countries. And the reason I raise that is it makes it very hard, as Governor DeSantis found out when he flew a bunch of Venezuelans up to Martha's Vineyard, who were people who were fleeing communism, right? These were not the kind of migrants that Republicans imagine in their head, right? When Republicans look at those people at the border, they see them as economic migrants and not as political people seeking political refugee or asylum status, right? And so I do think the fact that we are now seeing this enormous flow of Cubans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans really may change everybody's understanding or may create a whole new conversation that we haven't had before, requiring engagement. And to your point, whether that engagement is something that would be seen as being something that would be done to please the Cuban American community or done to, pursue America's national interests, I think these are going to be fascinating questions and debates. And I think Jim, I think you're asking all the right questions. And I think but what I think we know is we're going to know soon the answer to some of your questions, because this issue of what's happening at the border is requiring now far more direct engagement by everybody who cares about these issues, because the continued economic collapse that we're seeing and political collapse that we're seeing, particularly in Venezuela and Nicaragua, is a massive regional challenge for us now. And that there's going to have to be work. This is not something we can look away. So what it means is the administration is going to engage, and there is going to be significant energy put into it. Will they be as concerned in their solution about what voters in South Florida think? It's possible that you're right, that they won't, because they may not be thinking that it's going to be a competitive state in 2024, freeing them up to pursue what they think is the right thing to do, as opposed to the thing that's going to get them more votes. I don't know. And I think this is going to be, I think you've raised some really important questions, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue with you as this plays out over the next 6 months. But you're onto something really important, and I would keep at it.
Well, what it should do at a minimum is allow the Biden administration greater political space to build on the modest measures that it has already put in place starting in this year, 2022, and should not feel encumbered by electoral concerns in Florida to pursue engagement policies that the administration believes are in the national interest and in the best interest of the Cuban people.
Do you think that's been the case in the past, not just in terms of the Biden administration, but in terms of previous administrations? I mean, you know, going back, I'm old, so I can remember the days of Jorge Moscanosa sort of playing the middle between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was first running for office, and sort of using that dynamic to hold both sides a little bit hostage to the policies that he favored or that the more extreme elements of the Cuban American community favored. Did you see that in the past? And is this a watershed moment?
It's been a very long time since Cuban Americans voted on Cuba policy as a top 3 issue when considering who to support as a candidate. It's been decades, really. If you follow the polling, if you follow all research in the community, Cuban Americans don't vote on Cuba policy anymore, at least not in any significant numbers. There remains a small and dwindling base, mostly in the Republican side of the aisle right now. That continues to do so. But by and large, Cuban Americans vote on the same issues that the bulk of Americans do: the economy, healthcare. They don't, for them, Cuba measures specifically don't really factor in as much. And you notice that when you look at the polling, support for things like travel, for remittances, for visas out of the embassy in Havana, for diplomatic relations has remained fairly steady across administrations, regardless of whether a president is tightening or loosening up policy. What really moves the electorate when it comes to Cuba is showing leadership on the issue, coming to Miami, speaking to the community, holding events, gaining buy-in from the community, building those relationships, reducing the distance between Washington and Miami. That yields great dividends. That's what worked gangbusters for President Trump during his 4 years in the White House. Or rhetoric, using Cuba as, you know, as a rhetorical prop to basically, you know, to hammer Democrats and say, oh, they want to usher in Cuban-style socialism to the state of Florida. But it's not really the policy measures themselves. Again, policy measures have stopped moving the needle for decades now in the Cuban American community. We've never seen a Democrat win in Florida because they tried to out hardliners on Cuba. If a voter cares about hardline Cuba policy more than anything else, they'll vote Republican. They're a safe Republican voter. But this idea that Democrats can somehow chip away at that by taking a hard stance on policy or leaving the Trump sanctions in place, is just a complete fallacy.
Could it also not open up, you know, other, just in the terms of the raw politics of it, open up other paths where a Democrat perhaps running for the White House, or even a Republican running for the White House who takes now Florida for granted because Florida is safely red, may start to think more about Cuba policy vis-a-vis maybe how it plays in Iowa. Maybe Iowa farmers are more interested in opening up relations with Cuba so that they can sell their products, or Wisconsin dairy farmers, or tractor or car manufacturers in Michigan, all very important states that both Republicans and Democrats are now going to be competing over for the future of the White House. Maybe they start looking at Cuba policy through their prism as opposed to the South Florida prism. Is that a possibility?
I would agree with that to a large extent. There's a reduced incentive to heighten the contradictions over Cuba policy when Florida as a state is firmly on the red side of the aisle, right? You see this in Washington time and again, where you meet with Republicans from other parts of the country who otherwise support engagement policies, support some level of trade with Cuba, but don't want to touch the issue because what it could do to the chances of Republicans in the state of Florida. If the state of Florida is now officially red and it's no longer at play, then that becomes less of a concern.
When you served in Congress, how much do you believe the policies set by whoever was in the White House was guided more by the electoral map and Florida's role in it versus doing what they thought was in the best interest of the United States when it came to Cuba?
Well, I hope that the U.S. always does what's in the best interest of the country, regardless who's asking them to do something, whether it's the Cuban American community, the Jewish community, the Armenian community in the United States. So you want the U.S. to reflect your values, but you don't want the U.S. to do something that's against our national interests. And as a member of the United States Congress, I acted uh, in America's national interest. But I do think that the policy that reflects the values of America more closely has always been the Democratic Party. And that's why, on the heels of one of the first and biggest opening towards Cuba, Hillary Clinton did remarkably well in the Cuban American community. And we won Dade County. The reality is that since then, we've sort of adopted this sort of, QAnon Cuba position, which is, maximum pressure, and it has achieved nothing but more people in jail in Cuba, more expense for the family to help their family in Cuba, and massive immigration from not only the pressure on Cuba, but closing the US embassy. All those things are things that now towards the end, Joe Biden has been fixing some of those. And I think he should continue along that pathway because it clearly had tremendous results and benefits for the Cuban American community as well as for the United States.
You've recently been to Cuba. You met with Canal. Talk to me about what you think the possibilities are between the United States and Cuba at this point.
Look, I think there are some things that are of mutual interest for the United States government. I think there are things that would be of benefit for the people of Cuba. And I think there are things on the table that would be of benefit to the Cuban American community. Any negotiation that's going to have any chance of success means that everybody gets something to the benefit of that community. And I think there's enough on the table, as opposed to the scraps of the table, which was Donald Trump offered the Cuban American community, is a seat at the table. And you can't solve the Cuba problem without the Cuban American community. They are probably the most valuable asset of the nation of Cuba. And to engage them, it's not easy. Perhaps the great flaw that Obama's brilliant policy had is that he didn't engage the Cuban American community enough to make the policy stick. But by the end of his term, the majority of Cuban Americans were against the embargo. The majority of Cuban Americans, not the majority, but almost the majority, voted for Hillary Clinton. Clearly, they were accepting of that policy in a community that's overwhelmingly Republican. Clearly, it had political success, and I think it had success for the Cuban people, as well as the Cuban American community.
Now, it is important to note only Congress can lift the embargo, and there is no sign of that happening anytime soon. But we are already seeing the Biden administration taking moves that show they no longer worry about alienating voters in South Florida. John Kerry shaking hands with Nicolas Maduro at a climate summit, restaffing the American embassy in Cuba, holding talks with Cuba about deportations, detaining Venezuelan asylum seekers on the Mexico side of the border. They all show a shift in thinking in Washington. We'll have to wait and see how far this goes.